All right. Our next story comes from Bleeping Computer. The title here is U.S. offers $5 million for info on North Korean IT worker farms.
That's a huge amount of money.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I guess, the average IT career is having trouble these days. So maybe this is a good, a good alternative. But we've talked in the past about this, I think 3 or 4 times. And what most notably, there was the big hoopla around KnowBe4, who published a big blog post about how they got taken by a North Korean worker. But now the U.S. government is trying to put the clamp on this, and they're asking for the public's help. And if you help them figure out, where they're at and take them down, you can, be eligible for a reward of up to $5 million, which is pretty good.
Question for you. If I start up one of these, get it going, and then turn it in, do I get the money?
That question comes up again in a couple stories, I think. But I don't know. Obviously, it's a silly question, but I don't know how, as we've talked about in the past, I don't know how a company is really able to assess whether they're accidentally hiring somebody by one of these North Korean IT employee farms, as they're called. It's by design intended to mask the actual person that you're hiring. And I don't know what the answer is. And so to me, it feels like, the most likely person to collect this bounty would be like the HR, somebody in HR of some more sophisticated company.
Well, I think the way I would approach this is I understand it. This is a big laptop farm somewhere in the US, and the North Korean workers remote into this laptop and do their work. So if you own the hardware, right, if you insist on providing the hardware, and you have some sort of device assurance that hardware is your hardware through certificates or other means, and you control whether or not remote access software could be on there, you could prevent it that way.
And I think that in some of the reports that we read, the way they were doing it actually was by installing remote access software or turning on remote desktop. And,
right.
And so I think in those instances, you do have a chance. And maybe that's as far as the sophistication has gone, but like I could foresee them using network KVM. And if that's the case, like,
ooh, that's ugly.
That's really hard to detect. And maybe that's the wrong way to think about it, because that's not what the actors are doing here. And in that regards, maybe the way to detect this, like you said, is it'll be some help desk or sysadmin type person looking to see, like, look at your new hires, look at the profile of the workstations your new hires are using.
So if I let my company hire one of these workers and then turn them in, do I get the money?
Well, perhaps
$5 million would cover a lot of server costs.
Yeah,
just saying.
Absolutely. Perhaps it would.
But it is interesting. It is interesting. I mean, I don't mean to keep the whole thing as a joke, but it is an interesting problem. And it's interesting to me that the U.S. is willing to pay that much money. They consider it a very serious problem, and they're very worried about this if that's the kind of reward they've got up for this.
Well, so some of the interesting things, and I made a joke about this, and it is to some extent, joke worthy. So I don't mean to. I'm not trying to be a total wet blanket. But one of the things that struck me was this only works because the people are like completely remote.
Yeah.
They're not in office ever. They're interviewed remotely. They're hired remotely. They work remotely. And they're getting jobs where they're earning up to $300,000. I'm having a hard time plugging the reality of today's IT job market, which is return to office, layoffs everywhere, declining salaries, with this, like, people in North Korea are having success in getting fully remote jobs, faking an interview and getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it I don't know. It's weird. It's
maybe maybe you should go ask them for some tips.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of where I'm at. Like, you know, the $5 million bounty sounds interesting, but like if you could teach a class on how people could get a job that's fully remote, making $300,000 to actual legitimate people, you might be able to make even more than 5 million.
That's fair.
So anyway, it's certainly a big concern to the US government because we have in the US a hard embargo on North Korea, and there's a belief, whether it's true or not, I'm not smart enough to know, there's a belief that the money that's being paid to these employees is being funneled back to the North Korean government to fund their weapons programs. So whether that's the case or not, I don't know. That it is what the government is certainly saying about it. So they're taking it seriously.
Yeah. Interesting story. Interesting new wrinkle to care about and watch for in our world. Like I've been talking to my HR department at work and they're like, really? We have to worry about this now? Really? I'm like, sorry.
But yeah, so if I rewind back to like we covered this again, we've covered this a couple of times, and I think one of the most recent ones was the Know Before blog post about this.
Yep.
I guess underestimated how common this was. Like this sounds, I'm starting to get the sense that this is a much larger problem, and is happening much more commonly than I certainly gave it credit for.
Yeah. And I don't know how viable it is to tell people to do on-site interviews or fly people out to corporate and that sort of that. It seems expensive and slow, and that's not what companies want right now.
Yeah. And even there, by the way, I don't know how feasible it is, right? But like when one of my last assignments was leading a global team. Now, this was different contexts. It was in India, right? We were hiring pretty aggressively in India, and it was a fairly common practice for people to be able to hire a proxy to basically be a stand-in, to go through the whole interview process, like even including in-person interviews.
That's wild to me.
And then like they got paid to basically land you the job. And then like when you started the job, it wasn't the person that interviewed that actually showed up. It was, it was the actual person that hired the proxy. And so, I guess even if you're flying people out, I guess there's a way around that. That's, I guess, what my point is. And one of the concerns I have is that this is going to be yet another log on the return to office fire.
You may be right. Well,
which sucks.